So, I probably should have specified in the last episode that, though this series is called Earth-57, the first several episodes will focus on America. The reason for this is because I am an American, so it's the country I know best, and I've got to start somewhere. But rest assured, knowing that after I cover America's history to my satisfaction, I will move on to other parts of the planet. I recently overhauled this whole timeline, so it will take some time, but I will get to Europe, Asia, South America, Africa, and probably even Australia in time. With that out of the way, let's come back to the United States. The date is January 20th, 2037, and Gabriela Celaranta is being inaugurated as the 51st President of the United States after a successful and hard fought campaign with her Vice President, Ned Morrison. After 16 years of Patriot rule, the Democrats have finally taken back the presidency. I'm sure the Patriots weren't blindsided by this, because in the 2034 midterm elections, a tremendous blue wave swept the nation. Still, there were calls for recounts in nearly every state. Celeranta's first term is fairly uneventful, which, to be fair, is welcomed by the American populace. Don's Depression is cleaned up, and the Planetary Colonization Committee, which I'll make videos about sometime down the line, begins Phase 2 of its colonization plan in 2040, the Amar missions. Celeranta does have to deal with the fallout of a massive war in the Middle East, however, as a new force has entered the arena, the Fifth Caliphate. In 2037, Saudi Arabia's government was overthrown by a new sect of Islam called the Knights of Allah. After seizing Riyadh, the Knights of Allah, led by Abdul al-Birash, proclaimed the Fifth Caliphate. After this, they acquire sections of the Middle East through various means, utilizing both their impressive military and their diplomatic skills. Celeranta refuses to do anything about the situation, which earns her some media flack, but she is intent on keeping her terms as president peaceful and avoiding war. With the new pacifist platform, Celeranta wins the 2040 election pretty easily against warmongering Patriot challenger Reed Worthy, who, surprise surprise, accuses the Democrats of election fraud. Worthy fades into obscurity soon enough, however, as a new, charismatic Patriot candidate steps into the limelight, Patrick PARLIN. PARLIN was with President Haley during Don's Depression, and he had national acclaim for helping alleviate the nation of the harsh times. PARLIN is a fairly logical individual who can explain complicated things simply, which he does with his economic plans for the country. He's also somewhat expansionist and eager to get the US back on track as the world's police officer, swearing to not let the caliphate go unpunished. This sort of rhetoric works wonders for his campaign, and he often finds himself level with Celeranta in the polls. Unfortunately for Parlin, he isn't quite able to shake the stigma of the Patriot Party off himself, and his campaign suffers because of it. Most of the independents still flock to Celeranta, who paints Parlin as a candidate who would lead the country into an unnecessary war over things that don't concern the American people. After an aggressive campaign from each side, which included Celeranta's somewhat gruesome commercials meant to scare American voters into voting for her, Celeranta prevails. Just barely. She becomes the first president to serve more than 2 terms since FDR 100 years earlier. After a mediocre first 2 terms, Celeranta faces a nearly overwhelming wave of criticism from a rejuvenated Patriot Party, especially as she becomes more open about her socialist leanings. With someone to villainize, the Patriots take a firm anti-socialist stance like it was the 20s all over again. Even from within her own party, she was increasingly unpopular, mostly due to the speeches made by an older member of the party, a man named Anthony Shule. Shule was born in Los Angeles in 1973, so by the 2048 election, he's 75 years old. Regardless, he had always been a strong voice in the Democratic Party, ever since he was elected to the US Senate in 2026. Shule was a man who thought before he spoke, and had a generally shifty nature. As he became more and more outspoken, his critics on the right wing began to portray him as an untrustworthy, traitorous character. Despite this, he was cheered on as he announced his bid for the 2048 presidential election, eager to get rid of Celeranta and her socialist views, which Shule denounced as unrealistic goals not fit for a modern America. Running against Shule is, once again, Patrick Parlin. Despite his charisma on stage, Parlin is no match for Shule. This time around, the Democratic Party appeals aggressively to the independent swing voters, and even those within the party who were pro-socialism feared a Parlin presidency more than a Shule presidency, so they vote blue. Shule wins by a veritable landslide. Just as soon as Shule takes the oath of office does he go back on his campaign promises. Both Shule and Michael Bate, Shule's vice president, endorsed socialism within 3 months of the inauguration. Americans are furious, and conspiracy theories run wild. It's probably true that there was some sort of conspiracy within the Democratic Party during the 2048 election, but the true nature of that conspiracy, whatever it might have been, was never unearthed. Regardless, Shul becomes the Patriots' worst nightmare, while, ironically, adopting the key portion of their platform: reassertion of American dominance on the world stage. While signing executive order after executive order, and probably bribing several lawmakers, Shul goes about trying to bring the entire North American continent under American rule, one way or another. While he never directly engages in war, Shul sends people to infiltrate the Canadian and Mexican governments. In a timed maneuver, coups are attempted in both of America's neighbors. Canada manages to make it through, but Mexico's government is overthrown and replaced by a socialist puppet government led by Martin Guerrero on August 14th, 2050, which, has a certain kind of irony to it. While this is happening, President Schul declares himself the head of a new socialist party in the United States, leading Democratic voters away from their original party en masse. While there is still a Democratic presence in America, the socialists quickly grow to outnumber them, winning several seats in Congress in the 2050 midterms and many more by the 2052 elections. Speaking of the 2052 election, the Patriot Party was appalled by what was happening in the White House, and by early 2052 is split between those who support the increasingly radical Patrick PARLIN and those who support running a more moderate candidate. Party leaders meet, and it is decided that PARLIN will be thrown to the wayside in favor of a more moderate, more broadly appealing candidate. That candidate happens to be a younger man named Marcus Morsi. Morsi is a half Arabian man born in 2001 to an Egyptian immigrant and a white mother from Pittsburgh. Morsi runs a modest campaign, taking Schul's aggressive insults and refusing to reciprocate them, even during the especially obnoxious presidential debates. With his Take a Step Back campaign, Marcus Morsi and his vice presidential candidate, Jean CHANTEUR, appealed to many of those voters who wanted a break from all the mayhem of the Schul administration. After a long election season, Schul wins by a razor-thin margin. Or does he? Though most of the elections since 2020 have had allegations of voter fraud thrown around, this one is for real. The Tasche Commission, led by noted independent Senator Robert Tasche, determines that Marcus Morsi was the actual winner of the 2052 election on January 5th, 2053, just a couple weeks before the inauguration. Schul is furious, but there's not much he can do anymore. Whether or not he had plans to run again in 2056 doesn't matter, because he dies of a stroke while watching Morsi's inauguration on TV. After all that chaos, Morsi sits back and lets Congress do most of the work during his presidency. He announces early on that he does not wish to seek a second term, and Vice President Chanteur holds rallies to promote his presidential ambitions. Morsi's easygoing, laid-back term is interrupted on April 1st, 2054, by the last thing anyone expects. On that date, April Fool's Day, the New York Times runs an article announcing the accidental leaking of smallpox from a lab in St. Petersburg, Russia. Most of the world is unconcerned until it is discovered a week later that the existing vaccine stockpiles don't work. This is a different animal, a strain of smallpox developed a long time ago for the sole purpose of biological warfare. It is generally agreed that its release from St. Petersburg was an accident, but that ruling held no significance in the minds of the billions on Earth who all panicked at the same time as the media spread the word, and the fear. Morsi, not used to doing much actual work as president, wakes up early the next morning to find the White House in a frenzy. A few states have already called for lockdowns, and many others follow in the next few weeks as reports of smallpox come out of New York City, Seattle, Galveston, Chicago, etc. The death toll is staggering in just a short period of time. Taking a quick break from the narrative, I'd like to mention that one of the novels I have planned, and have already started writing in fact, takes place during this time period. It follows the life of a teenager in Terre Haute, Indiana, as he learns how to cope with the pandemic. Alright, back to our regularly scheduled program. As the pox spreads around the world, the people freak out and raise hell. The stupidity of the COVID pandemic rears its ugly head again in many parts of the world, and in others, such as China, the government just up and leaves. I'm picking on China specifically here because on May 14th, 2054, the PRC government flees to North Korea. China had already been experiencing some internal strains as rebellions flared up in East Turkestan, as well as reactionary religious movements seizing parts of various cities. China was probably liable to implode on its own, but the pox hurried the process. Morsi and Chantour, or President Pox and the Chanter, urge caution as the nation simmers with anger, resentment, and fear. Both sides of the political aisle blame each other for their present situation. The US and most of Europe place the blame on Russia. Russia transfers the blame to China, and China collapses. Only Iceland and New Zealand are able to function normally, while the rest of the world is on fire because they closed their borders and kept them shut once word spread about the pox. Chantour's chances of running for president are more or less shot by now, and he actually resigns from his post as vice president on October 25th, 2054. Morsi is all on his own now, and suffers a mental breakdown that leaves him incapacitated for the next week. All the while, the United States falls into yet another depression, and the states are on their knees begging for help from the federal government, which can't really do much about the situation. Seeing no better choice, many in the country turn to radicalism for refuge. The Patriot Party's Tom Clearlake becomes wildly popular as he makes outlandish claims about a socialist conspiracy to bring the pox into the country. The socialists see their chance to win an election and play it safe, settling on the moderate candidate Joseph Palmer for 2056. Before the 2056 election, however, salvation appears in the form of a California company named Stylix. Stylix is a multi-purpose sort of enterprise, comparable to B&L from the Pixar universe, albeit much, much smaller. It's only known along the West Coast until they announce their vaccine efforts have yielded an FDA-approved shot. Stylix becomes a household name overnight, and their power and influence grow exponentially in just as short a time. This may seem random now, but it is incredibly important in the episode after this one. Anyway, starting in January 2055, vaccines are distributed across the country and the world. By the end of the year, most of the developed world is ready to get back to normal. But when 2056 begins, it brings with it all those pent-up political tensions that the smallpox pandemic brought to light. Millions of deaths are on someone's hands, but whose? No one in the US can seem to agree, and Morsi wisely chooses not to make himself a target by staying out of the public eye and doing very little in the way of actually governing. As election season ramps up, the two going head to head are the boisterous Patriot candidate Tom Clearlake and his dim-witted vice presidential pick, Joseph Capricci, and the moderate and soft-spoken socialist candidate, Joseph Palmer, and his vice presidential pick, the relatively unknown Whitney Delapue. Clearlake stirs up all sorts of controversy, but nothing the media throws at him can damage his personality. Palmer, on the other hand, appeals to the more logical side of America that's fed up with all the stupid politics and the hectic last several years. And the winner is going to be announced in the next episode, so subscribe so you don't miss out on the winner of this incredibly consequential election. I hope you enjoyed seeing the world's slow descent into madness as a tiny virus wrapped its unsanitary fist around it. This is why we world build, to escape from the craziness of the real-life world. Leave your feedback in the comments section, and I'll be sure to get to what you have to say as soon as I can. See you all in the next one.